Well, hello, and we're in John's Gospel, and we're going to read verses 16 to 21. And this should be fairly short. Jesus has just fed the 5,000. After that, we're going to get one of the most important passages, one of the most important passages in John's Gospel, particularly in chapter 6, where Jesus talks about himself being the bread of life. But in between, Jesus walks on water. So, reading from verse 16, as usual from the ESV. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they'd rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So, a few general points to note first of all. Right? The disciples, those of them who were fishermen, would have been quite used to going in a boat in the dark. They would sometimes go out to fish in the dark. And the Sea of Galilee, it was known that you would get strong winds blowing down onto the Sea of Galilee. Now, this incident is recorded in Matthew's Gospel and I think in Mark's Gospel as well. John gives far fewer details, very little details at all. Matthew probably gives the most. In fact, he almost certainly does, because it's Matthew who talks about Peter going out onto the water. Mark doesn't mention it, almost certainly because Peter was kind of behind Mark's Gospel, i.e. Mark got a lot of his information directly from Peter, and Peter did not want to draw attention to himself. But here we've got hardly any details at all. And just raise the question, why did John put this in? The various possible explanations. One is that, one just to provide the continuity, but how they got to the other side. Another is that the miracle that Jesus has just done of feeding the 5,000 is a physical world miracle. And we have another physical world miracle. Now, people do not walk on water. It doesn't happen. We don't do it. Jesus did walk on water. I must say, John gives so little information on this, gives so little focus to it, which in some ways is quite odd. And if we look at what it does say, the fact they went to the other side, which may be the prime reason John put it in here. Jesus wasn't with them at the outset. The sea became rough. It doesn't talk about them being frightened of the waves. They were frightened when they saw Jesus. It says they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near to the boat, and they were frightened. And Jesus again says to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And that phrase, "do not be afraid," is one which occurs, well, it occurs in the lips of Jesus a number of times, occurs elsewhere in the Bible, that God does something out of the ordinary. And that, because that very fact can instill fear in us. Because things aren't working the way we expect them to. But Jesus says to them, "Don't be afraid, it is I." And there are times in our lives when God will do things which are out of the ordinary. And we might be scared in those situations. But if it's God who's working, we do not need to be afraid. Now, another point to note is that Jesus walked on water here. This is the only time that he walked on water. At least if he did it any other times, we're not told about it. And we need this balance. God does not do miracles every 2 minutes, at least in any one person's life, every 2 minutes. Globally, I've no idea. I've had to work things out, won't I? If he did every 2 minutes, how many miracles would he do a day? Jesus doesn't do miracles in our lives continually. But sometimes he may do. And we need to have both those thoughts in our minds. And then it says, right at the end, then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Now that's a bit of a miracle. They got there just poof, in an instant like that. Anyway, we'll stop there. That's Jesus walking on the water, which John does not give much attention to, apart from describing that it happened. Which is, I've mentioned this before, John's Gospel is quite different from the other three. It's different, it was almost certainly written much later, and it's looking at things in some ways a much more thoughtful perspective, but it's consistent with the other three Gospels. Then on the next ones, few talks, which might take a while, we'll get into some of the deep teaching that Jesus gives. Amen.